She was 40. He was 25. Nobody in Hollywood thought it would last more than a year, and even Demi Moore admits now that for a long time, she wasn't sure it would either. But what she said publicly since then, in her own words, is stranger and sadder and more human than any tabloid headline ever managed to capture. This is the story of what actually happened, as Demi Moore herself has told it. Long before there was a Bruce Willis, an Ashton Kutcher, or a Ghost, there was a kid from Roswell, New Mexico, who grew up with almost nothing stable to hold on to. In her 2019 memoir Inside Out, Moore wrote candidly about a childhood defined by constant relocation, by her count, well over 24 moves before she was even a teenager, and about parents who struggled with alcohol. She's spoken openly about a mother who battled her own demons, including a suicide attempt Moore witnessed as a child, an experience she has said shaped her sense of safety for years afterward. She struggled in school, was diagnosed with dyslexia, and by 16 had left home to support herself, taking jobs that ranged from modeling to bill collecting. None of it looked like the beginning of a Hollywood career, but Demi Moore has never been someone who waited for permission. At 19, she landed a role on the soap opera General Hospital, playing a journalist named Jackie Templeton. Paid modestly, but it put her in front of people who mattered. Around this same period, Moore has spoken about wrestling with substance use as a young actress. Struggles, she says, came to a head during the making of St. Elmo's Fire in 1985, when director Joel Schumacher reportedly told her she needed to get sober to keep the role. She did. That film became a cultural touchstone, part of what critics later dubbed the Brat Pack wave of young stars, and it opened the door to bigger and bigger work. 5 years later came Ghost. Made on a modest budget, it became one of the biggest hits of 1990, propelled by a pottery wheel scene that turned into one of the most referenced moments in movie history. Moore's short haircut became a trend on its own. It also happened to be a strange, wonderful coincidence in her personal life. Her then-husband Bruce Willis had Die Hard 2 in theaters at the same time, meaning the couple briefly had two of the top films in the country running simultaneously. Moore and Willis had married in 1987 after a famously fast courtship, reportedly proposing during a boxing match and marrying that same night in Las Vegas. They went on to have 3 daughters, Rumor, Scout, and Tallulah. Moore kept working through motherhood in ways that were unusual for the era. In 1991, she posed nude and visibly pregnant for the cover of Vanity Fair, an image that became iconic and, by her own account, was meant to push back on the idea that pregnancy should be hidden or treated as something to be ashamed of. She continued taking bold, sometimes controversial roles. Indecent Proposal, Striptease, and G.I. Jane, in which she shaved her head on camera and trained intensely for the physical demands of the part. She said publicly that this era of her career came with a cost: intense media scrutiny, harsh criticism, and, as she later wrote, the beginnings of struggles with body image that would follow her for years. In 1998, after 11 years of marriage, Moore and Willis separated. What made their split unusual, even at the time, was how it played out afterward. They remained close, co-parented their daughters without the public acrimony so common in celebrity divorces, and continued showing up for each other at family milestones for decades. That pattern, respect outlasting romance, would become one of the most consistent threads of Moore's adult life, one she's returned to in interviews again and again. Then, in 2003, she met Ashton Kutcher at the premiere of Charlie's Angels. Full Throttle. She was 40. He was 25. The math alone was enough to make headlines, and it did, extensively. Moore has spoken about how quickly the relationship moved and how much public fascination surrounded the age gap, including talk show jokes and tabloid obsession that followed them for years. She's also spoken with humor about it in hindsight, including appearing in a 2005 Saturday Night Live sketch that poked fun at exactly that dynamic. In September 2005, they married in a private ceremony at their home in Beverly Hills. What Moore has described publicly as one of the hardest periods of her life came not long after. In her memoir, she wrote about a pregnancy loss in 2003. She was several months along when she and Kutcher learned the pregnancy would not continue. She has written candidly about how deeply that loss affected her, describing a period of grief that she says contributed to a return of old patterns around alcohol and her relationship with food and her body. She has also written that the loss put real strain on her marriage. Not because either person did anything wrong, she said, but because grief can be a very isolating experience, and she and Kutcher processed it differently. The marriage ultimately ended in 2011, with Moore announcing their separation that November. The divorce took nearly 2 years to finalize. In interviews since, both Moore and Kutcher have spoken about that period as painful and difficult to work through, each acknowledging their own struggles during and after the split, without either turning it into a public blame campaign in the years that followed. What Moore has been most unflinching about, though, is what happened to her afterward. In her memoir, she described a period in the early 2010s marked by addiction, a relapse after nearly 2 decades of sobriety. She's written about how isolated she became during that stretch, and about the toll it took on her relationship with her 3 daughters, who by her own account distanced themselves from her for a period of time as they watched her struggle. That estrangement and the slow process of rebuilding trust with Rumor, Scout, and Tallulah became one of the most discussed threads of her memoir and of the family's later joint appearances, including candid conversations the 4 of them had together on the show Red Table Talk. What she's described is not a tidy redemption arc. It's years of therapy, family counseling, and showing up, imperfectly, again and again. That work seems to have paid off. In the years since, Moore and her daughters have spoken openly about rebuilding their relationship, marking milestones together publicly, and supporting one another through their own adult lives. She's also remained close with Bruce Willis and his family. When Willis's family shared his aphasia diagnosis in 2022, Moore was among those who offered public support, and she has continued to appear at family gatherings alongside Willis and his wife, Emma Hemming Willis. A continuation of the same pattern that defined her divorce from him decades earlier, staying in each other's lives, on purpose, long after the romance ended. Now in her 60s, Moore has talked in interviews about arriving at a different relationship with love altogether. One centered less on needing a partner to feel complete and more on a sense of wholeness she says she has worked hard to build on her own. She's described her current outlook as being open to connection without needing it, a philosophy that resonated widely enough to spark conversation online when she discussed it in a Vogue interview around her 62nd birthday. What makes Demi Moore's story land the way it does isn't scandal. It's the fact that she has been willing to say, in her own words and on her own terms, that a life can include enormous success and enormous pain at the same time, and that neither one cancels the other out. She built one of the most successful careers of her generation while quietly carrying decades of things most people never would have guessed. And when it finally became too heavy to carry alone, she said so, publicly, honestly, and without pretending the recovery was instant or easy. That, more than any headline about an age gap or a breakup, is probably the real reason people are still listening to Demi Moore's story decades into her career. Not because of who she dated, but because of how honestly she's been willing to talk about what it actually cost her, and what it took to come back from it.